Okay, kids, hold on to your seats because this is a big one. This is Preterite versus Imperfect, and this is video number 1. In this video, we are going to explore the basic differences between the preterite versus the imperfect, get into a few of the specific situations. And in video 2, we're going to study some of the words that get associated with both tenses, and we're also going to explore the 3 situations. So hold on to your seats and enjoy this one. So before we can get into the differences between preterite and imperfect, just a quick review on the imperfect tense. I'm just going to leave this chart here for you because it's a very simple tense. You have your AR endings here. Just note the accent mark on habemos. You have your ER and IR endings here. Note all the accent marks here over the first I's, ia, es, ia, etc. And then you have your 3 irregulars, ser, ver, and ir. Ser is a verb you should be familiar with. Cuando era niño. Éramos has an accent mark. Ver, not too irregular. The only thing that makes it irregular is that you're just dropping the R instead of the E and the R. And then ir, ibas, iba, etc. Be careful. There is an accent mark right there on íbamos. And one thing we want to be careful not to do is to think that these are endings for IR verbs. This is the verb ir. This is the verb ir. So we can't have viviba and vivibus, as cool as that would sound and as logical as it would be. Can't do that. This is just the verb ir. So you can take a minute, copy this down. If you want to pause the video, that's fine. But I don't want to spend too much time going over the imperfect as a tense. You already know it's pretty easy to do. Okay, so starting with this slide, these notes are going to correspond to the graphic organizer that you have. And we're going to start with the general differences between the two. So this is just generally speaking. Now, we're going to take this definition and we're going to break it down further into its individual components on the subsequent slides and on the subsequent boxes on your graphic organizer. So this is just a general overview. So if you're somewhat confused by this particular box, I wouldn't get overly concerned because it's going to get broken down further on in the later slides. So the preterite basically is a specific action or a series of actions that occur at a specific time or during a specific period of time. Describes what happened or what occurred. In other words, the preterite and the imperfect obviously both discuss the past. The preterite is going to be something that happens at a specific time, a specific known time, or a specific period of time. And it basically breaks down to what happened or what occurred. The imperfect is obviously going to be the opposite of that. They're different. The imperfect is going to describe ongoing or habitual actions of the past that occurred an unknown amount of times or at a non-specific time in the past. Describes what was happening and what used to be. Think of the preterite as a more rigid tense. We know exactly when things happen. We can pinpoint them. And the imperfect is more of a fluid tense in the past where it's more difficult to pinpoint exact actions at specific times or exactly how many times things occurred. Again, the imperfect describes what was happening and what used to be. As a matter of fact, when you conjugate the imperfect and you translate it into English, if we have a verb like hablaba, that's going to translate one of 2 different ways depending on context. I was talking, or I used to talk. So it's what was happening or what used to be. Okay, so the next slide down, we are now beginning to break down that generally speaking definition of each one of the 2 tenses. So, for the number of times that things happened, again, preterite over here and imperfect over here. The preterite is something that happened once or a certain amount of times, a known amount of times. So something that happened once. Yo fui al cine anoche. I went to the movie theater last night, probably alone. This is something that happened once. How do I know it happened once? Well, I have a word like this in here, anoche, last night. It lets me know that the action happened once, and it also lets me know when it happened. And we're going to go over in a later slide some key words for both tenses. Or a known amount of times. Nosotros fuimos para comer afuera 2 veces la semana pasada. We went out to eat 2 times last week. In this particular case, you're going to use the word vez or veces for times. We never would use the word tiempos here. Veces. You know exactly how many times it happened. 2. Dos veces. On the imperfect side of things, that is something that used to happen, usually habitually, an unknown amount of times. We don't know how many times it happened. Cuando yo era joven, cuando yo era un niño, yo siempre trepaba los árboles. We don't know how many times we climbed those trees. It's an action by habit. The word siempre in here. Okay, it's an action by habit. So we don't know how many times it happened. If I did it a lot, well, how many times is that? If I did that sometimes, how many times is that? It's kind of ambiguous. One thing to keep in mind here is that we're only going to count up to a certain amount of times. We don't write sentences like, when I was a kid, I climbed that tree 513 times. After a while, you just stop counting, maybe after like 9. We just don't count anymore. So when we talk about a known amount of times, you're not going to see some giant number in here because after a while, we just stop counting. So again, just focus on if it happened once, and we'll have some keywords in the sentence, or how many times it happened exactly within a reasonable amount. And then actions that happen habitually, a lot, sometimes never, where you can't pinpoint how many times it happened, that's going to be the imperfect. All right, the next slide here is for the period of time. Again, we have preterite, we have imperfect. And the period of time describes when the action occurred in the past. So, for the preterite, as we've already discussed a little bit, is something that happened at a specific time or a specific period of time. Now, something that happened at a specific time, a good example is in the previous slide. Yo fui al cine anoche. I went last night. That is a specific time. A specific period of time. Jorge W. Bush fue el presidente de los Estados Unidos por 8 años. Desafortunadamente. Okay, George Bush was the president of the United States for 8 years, unfortunately. So this is a period of time, so I'm going to use the preterite here. I know exactly how long that occurred for. The imperfect, as one would guess, is going to be the opposite of that. Something that happened at an unknown time or for an unknown period of time, against this that kind of idea of it's floating around in the past. Ellos jugaban a esconditas. They were playing hide and seek, or they used to play hide and seek. When? Well, we don't know. And because we don't know, we're going to be using the imperfect here. A lot of times I get the question, well, what's specific enough to be considered the preterite? Well, the least specific you could get with it still being the preterite would be an expression like un día. Un día yo comí en ese restaurante. One day I ate in that restaurant. That is specific enough, this one day, to be still considered the preterite. We don't need sentences like, well, it's 7:14 and 38 seconds Eastern Standard Time last night. I did my homework. It doesn't have to get broken down that far. Un día, one day, is still specific enough to be considered the preterite. And the last slide for preterite versus imperfect, part 1, is going to be this one. And for me, this is the most important slide of them all because this really captures everything that the preterite and the imperfect truly stand for. And that is the main actions and the events surrounding those actions. So, the preterite are actions or a series of actions that move the story along. So, in other words, they are the actions that move the story from A to B and B to C and C to D and D to E, etc. So, if you think of the preterite as a timeline, or you think of the past as a timeline, The preterite is going to be all of those events that fit very nicely on the timeline, and they move the story of the past along. So they move things from A to B, from B to C, and from C to D, and from D to E. They move that story right along. You want to look for sequencing words. Those are usually triggers for the preterite. Words like first, and later, and then, and so, and second, and third, and finally, and lastly. Those are usually words that are going to trigger you seeing the story being moved from point to point. Primero yo puse la mesa, segundo yo anduve a mi dormitorio. First I set the table and I walked to my room. First I did this, then I did this. I'm narrating a series of actions that are moving the story along. The imperfect, on the other hand, is going to be background information surrounding the main events. So if the first thing I did was set the table, that is a main action that's going to move the story along. The background information might be what I was wearing, what the weather was like, what time it was. That's all background information. So things like setting and weather and age and physical and personality descriptions, time, etc. All that background information that surrounds the main events is the imperfect tense. So all of this extra information that doesn't quite fit on the timeline is going to be the imperfect tense. Maybe what the weather was and how old somebody was and what they looked like and what time it was and all that stuff is going to be the imperfect tense. Try to think of it in a different way. If you were to tell the story of, well, I would say Finding Nemo, but as we all know, I don't know that one. Or Up, all I know is Russell. If we were to say tell the story of Cinderella without any of the extra information, in other words, we stuck to just the preterite part of that story, well, what would it look like? Cinderella went to the ball. Cinderella lost her slipper. The prince found it. They got married. Happily ever after. We'd have to leave out all that extra information. She was a girl. She had stepsisters. There was a pumpkin. All of that extra information I have to leave out. That the preterite is the main actions of the story that move it from point to point to point to point. And the background stuff is the imperfect. That's all that stuff that's going to surround the main actions. Another way to think of it is, are you a preterite person or are you an imperfect person? The imperfect person is that person, and we all know this person, you might be this person yourself, that when they tell a story, there's no point to it, and it usually includes a bazillion details that nobody cares about. The story might be that you had something stolen at school, and the story starts with, oh, well, when I woke up, I think I saw the sun a little bit, and I had those little crusty things in my eye, and so I got one of those crusty things out, and then I thought to myself, oh, today's going to be a really long day because I have 3 tests and a quiz, and I'm not really sure what I'm going to do. And then you're sitting there listening to this story, and you have no idea what's going on, what the point is. And those are the imperfect people that have to include every single detail there is in the story. And the predator people are the people that just get right to the point and they tell it like it is. What moves the story from point to point to point to point. When I think about predator and imperfect, for me it always comes down to this question right here. Is this a main action or is it background information? And every single time that I do a predator versus imperfect practice sheet, test, quiz, etc., whatever, every time that I come to an example, this is the question I ask myself. Is this a main action or is this background information? There's a lot of factors that help me get to my answer, but once I can answer this question, I'm good. Main action, preterite, background information, imperfect.